The day victory was declared in Europe, the White House should have been a place of celebration. Instead, behind the heavy oak doors of the Oval Office, the air felt colder than ever. Harry Truman sat alone at his desk, the same desk Franklin Roosevelt had used. The papers still smelled faintly of the late president's pipe tobacco. Outside, crowds cheered in the streets, waving flags, shouting Roosevelt's name in gratitude. Inside, Truman's hand trembled as he lifted a pen, then set it down again. He had just made a quiet, private decision, one that no aide dared to question. For the next 6 months, no one in his administration was to speak the name Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Not in meetings, not in briefings, not even in casual conversation. The order was not written down, but everyone understood it. Secretaries learned to pause before saying, Roosevelt. Cabinet members rehearsed their sentences to avoid it. The man who had led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II had become, for a time, a forbidden name. Why? That question would haunt historians for decades. Some said Truman's decision came from bitterness, that he felt overshadowed, humiliated by inheriting a legacy too immense to match. Others believed it was grief, a desperate attempt to step out of the shadow of a man worshipped like a political deity. But the truth was more complex, more human, and far more tragic. When Roosevelt died in April of 1945, Truman was barely prepared to be vice president, let alone president. He had met privately with Roosevelt only twice in the months before his death. He didn't even know about the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program building a weapon that would soon change the world forever. What Truman inherited wasn't just power, it was chaos wrapped in secrets. And as he began to uncover what Roosevelt had hidden, the weight of those discoveries threatened to crush him. This wasn't just a story about two presidents. It was a story about loyalty and betrayal, legacy and guilt, about what happens when a man inherits another man's unfinished war and finds that victory can feel like punishment. For Truman, banning Roosevelt's name wasn't an act of spite. It was the only way he could silence the ghost that refused to leave the room. The first weeks after Roosevelt's death were a blur of handshakes, funerals, and headlines. Harry Truman smiled for cameras, gave calm speeches, and pretended to understand the machine he had just inherited. But behind closed doors, he realized something alarming. He didn't know how the war was truly being run. Each day, new files arrived on his desk marked top secret. Each one revealed another piece of Roosevelt's private empire, projects, alliances, and operations that the late president had never bothered to share. One afternoon, Truman called in his military advisor, General George Marshall, and asked a simple question. What exactly are we doing about Japan? Marshall hesitated. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder sealed with red wax. Inside was a single page with a heading Truman had never seen before, the Manhattan Engineer District. In that moment, Truman learned that the United States had been building an atomic weapon, one powerful enough to destroy an entire city in a single strike. He sat in silence as Marshall explained the scope, the scientists, the secrecy. Roosevelt had authorized the project years ago, and never once mentioned it to his own vice president. Truman was stunned. "How long have we had this?" he asked. Marshall replied, "Long enough to change the world, sir." From that day forward, Truman viewed every document with suspicion. If Roosevelt had hidden something that monumental, what else had he buried? Soon he discovered more, private letters between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, discussing post-war boundaries and spheres of influence. Memoranda about the Yalta Conference, decisions Roosevelt had made alone, often without consulting Congress or even his own cabinet. Truman began to feel less like a successor and more like a man living inside someone else's secrets. The worst part was the tone of the correspondence. Roosevelt spoke to world leaders like a man convinced he could bend history to his will. To Truman, it felt arrogant, reckless, and dangerously naive. He told his Secretary of State, "I'm cleaning up a mess I didn't make." But it was more than a mess. It was a revelation. Truman wasn't just inheriting a presidency. He was inheriting an illusion. Roosevelt had built his legacy on charm and control, a web of personal diplomacy that had kept allies close and kept the truth even closer. And now, for the first time, the web was unraveling. The files Truman read late into the night showed not just strategy, but obsession. A man who had tried to shape the post-war world in his own image. The deeper Truman looked, the more he realized. He wasn't stepping into Roosevelt's shoes. He was standing in the footprints of a man who had never planned to leave. By summer of 1945, Truman was president in name. But in every other sense, Roosevelt still ruled from the grave. Every meeting, every memo, every newspaper headline seemed to whisper the same question. What would Franklin do? The White House press corps compared Truman's plain speech to Roosevelt's charm. Foreign leaders treated him like a clerk who'd stumbled into the throne room. Even his own cabinet, most of them Roosevelt's loyalists, spoke of the late president with near religious reverence. It wasn't that Truman hated Roosevelt. He admired the man's brilliance, but he despised the myth. Roosevelt had been untouchable, the savior of democracy, the architect of victory. How was any man supposed to lead in the shadow of a saint? Truman's patience snapped one morning during a briefing. A staff officer had referred to President Roosevelt's post-war plan, as if Truman didn't exist. The room went silent as Truman leaned forward and said quietly, "Gentlemen, President Roosevelt is gone. Let's talk about what the living intend to do." That single sentence changed the atmosphere of the entire administration. From then on, Roosevelt's name vanished from conversation. Truman didn't write the order, but everyone understood it. The ban had begun. By late summer, Truman's patience with Roosevelt's shadow had reached its limit. Each morning brought new discoveries, each one worse than the last. Secret memoranda from Yalta, letters to Stalin, and private agreements that Roosevelt had kept even from his own military chiefs. One cable, dated February of 1945, left Truman speechless. It showed Roosevelt promising concessions in Eastern Europe that would later spark the Cold War. Vague lines on a map that gave Stalin control of entire nations. Truman read it twice, his jaw tightening. The man America worshipped as a visionary had, in Truman's eyes, sold away the very ideals the war had been fought to protect. When he slammed the file shut, his aide saw the veins in his hand tremble. "He gave the Soviets half of Europe," Truman muttered, "and they called me naive." That night, he met privately with Secretary of State James Burns and Defense Secretary Henry Stimson. For hours, they argued over how much of Roosevelt's diplomacy should be made public. Burns urged caution. "You can't tarnish a dead man," he said. But Truman was unrelenting. "If the truth makes him look bad, that's on him. I won't carry his sins to protect a legend." The argument ended without resolution, but the tone was set. For the first time, Truman was no longer managing Roosevelt's legacy. He was tearing it down brick by brick. Then came Potsdam, Truman's first major summit with Churchill and Stalin, meant to finalize the terms of peace. He carried with him the full knowledge of Roosevelt's secret world, and an atomic weapon that Roosevelt had built but never seen finished. As the Allied leaders gathered, Truman's demeanor was calm, but inside he was a storm. He watched Stalin closely, the man Roosevelt had once trusted as a partner. Truman didn't see a partner, he saw a predator. And in that moment, he made a silent vow. Roosevelt's diplomacy had ended with Roosevelt's death. From now on, America would speak with strength, not sentiment. Within weeks, the tone of global politics had changed. The Soviet Union went from ally to rival. The friendship Roosevelt had nurtured at Yalta turned to suspicion at Potsdam. And when Truman authorized the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world understood that a new kind of president was in charge, one who would not be haunted by another man's promises. When the war finally ended, Truman's approval rating soared, but behind the victory parades and newspaper headlines, he remained uneasy. He had won the peace, yes, but at the cost of becoming the very thing he once despised, a man willing to hide the truth for the sake of order. The shadow of Roosevelt hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed shape, and now it lived inside him. The decision was more than pride. It was survival. Truman was trying to reclaim the presidency from the ghost that still occupied his chair. He moved Roosevelt's portrait from behind the desk to the far wall, facing away from him. He stopped using Roosevelt's signature blue stationery. Even the pipe rack that had sat on the desk for 12 years was quietly removed. But the press noticed everything. They wrote that Truman was trying to erase his predecessor's memory. Some called him insecure, others vindictive. None of them saw the truth. that every reminder of Roosevelt reminded Truman of how unprepared he had been, how the nation had mourned a man they didn't realize had left behind a trail of unfinished, dangerous decisions. In the evenings, Truman would walk the White House halls alone, passing portraits of former presidents, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt. He once told an aide, "It's like living in a museum of ghosts. Every wall has eyes." And in a way, he was right. Roosevelt's shadow wasn't just political. It was emotional. For the American people, Roosevelt's death had felt like losing a father. For Truman, it was like being forced to replace one, a task no one wanted and no one thought he could do. Still, as the months passed, Truman began to realize that the only way to escape Roosevelt's shadow was not to fight it, but to face it. By the autumn of 1945, Harry Truman had won the war, but lost his peace. The atomic bomb had ended the conflict, but it had also unleashed something that couldn't be contained: guilt. Every time he saw the photographs of Hiroshima, the flattened city, the shadows burned into walls, he remembered the memo Roosevelt had signed years earlier, authorizing its creation. Truman hadn't built the weapon, but he had chosen to use it. And in quiet moments, he wondered if Roosevelt had known all along that the burden of that choice would fall on someone else. The press, meanwhile, had turned Roosevelt into a saint. Newspapers printed his smiling portrait beside headlines about peace and prosperity, as if the man himself had orchestrated victory from beyond the grave. Even in foreign capitals, Roosevelt's name was spoken like scripture. At Yalta, he had been the voice of reason. At home, the man who saved democracy. And for Truman, each glowing tribute felt like another nail in his coffin. He couldn't escape the comparisons. Every speech he gave was measured against Roosevelt's eloquence. Every decision, every hesitation was judged as a lesser man's imitation. One night, after reading a glowing editorial about Roosevelt's spirit of global unity, Truman closed the paper and said to his aide, "They forget. He left me a world already broken." That frustration became policy. For months, Truman refused to attend any ceremony that invoked Roosevelt's memory. He rejected proposals to rename government buildings and declined invitations from Eleanor Roosevelt to speak at memorial events. To the public, it looked cold, even cruel. But inside the White House, the staff understood. This wasn't hatred, it was mourning that had curdled into exhaustion. Truman wasn't just competing with Roosevelt's legacy. He was still grieving the man himself. Despite the anger, he'd admired Roosevelt deeply. He had trusted him, even envied him. And now, every mention of his name was a reminder of how alone Truman truly was. In private, he confessed to his military aide, Harry Vaughn, "It feels like he never left. His voice is in every briefing, every decision, every damn headline. I can't breathe for all the ghosts in this house." Vaughn said nothing. What could he say? The nation saw Truman as confident, decisive, victorious. But behind the closed doors of the Oval Office, he was a man haunted by another man's unfinished work and the unbearable pressure of living up to a myth. By November, the ban had become more than an order. It was a kind of exorcism. Truman didn't want to destroy Roosevelt's memory. He wanted silence, because silence was the only thing that made the ghosts go away. By early 1946, the silence inside the White House had become almost sacred. 6 months had passed since Roosevelt's name had last been spoken aloud within those walls. The portraits still hung, but they were no longer shrines, just reminders. Truman had done what he set out to do: lead in his own voice. He had faced down Stalin, rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, and redefined the post-war world on American terms. But the cost of that independence was isolation. Even those closest to him saw the toll. He rarely smiled, his correspondence grew shorter, and his nights longer. It wasn't until Eleanor Roosevelt visited him in private that the silence finally broke. She found him alone in the Oval Office, staring at a single photograph of Franklin taken during his last days. She said quietly, "You can stop fighting him now, Harry. You've carried him long enough." Truman didn't answer right away. Then, without looking up, he said, "I just wanted them to see me, not the shadow." Eleanor smiled softly. "You never were in his shadow. You were the light that came after." That meeting changed everything. The next morning, for the first time in half a year, Truman spoke Roosevelt's name during a press briefing. He referred to him as the man who built the road I had to finish walking. The reporters in the room froze, not out of shock, but respect. The ban, unspoken yet absolute, had finally ended. And in that moment, the weight lifted. For the first time since taking office, Truman was no longer the accidental president, the substitute, or the reluctant heir. He was simply Harry Truman, a man who had inherited a broken world and dared to rebuild it his way. History would remember him as blunt, stubborn, and sometimes unpopular. But even his critics would later admit one thing: Truman had restored the presidency from myth to humanity. And perhaps that was the truest way to honor Roosevelt after all, not through worship, but through continuation. The silence that began in grief ended in gratitude. Because in the end, Truman finally understood that leadership isn't about escaping another man's shadow. It's about learning to stand where the light finally reaches you. If you've made it this far, you've seen the untold struggle behind the headlines, the story of a man haunted by legacy, yet defined by resilience. If you want to keep uncovering the human stories buried beneath history's surface, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Buried Battles for more untold moments that shaped our world.